evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Beard Time Stories. Tonight we will be reading chapters 14 and 15, Pride and Prejudice. Let's jump right in. Now, real quick though, we did talk last time about how the main antagonist has been introduced, and that would be Mr. Bennet's nephew, who is a priest who stands to inherit the entire estate when Mr. Bennet dies. Therefore, if he should die before all of his daughters are married off, they have the potential to be homeless. So that creates the main conflict of the narrative from here on out. So, Pride and Prejudice, Chapter 14. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, but when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness. Lady Catherine de Boaux's attention to his wishes, and consideration for his comfort, appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him to more than usual solemnity of manner. With a most important aspect, he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behavior in a person of rank, such affability and condescension. Condescension. We are not drizzling upon said person of rank. Such affability and condescension as he himself had experienced from Lady Catherine. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both the discourses, which he had already had the honor of preaching before her. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rosings, and had sent for him only that Saturday before, to make up her pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as though she would any other gentleman, and she had made not the slightest objection in his joining to the society of the neighborhood, nor to his leaving the parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even condescended to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had at once paid him a visit in his humble patronage, where she had perfectly approved all the alternatives he had been making, and had even vouched to suggest some herself, some shelves in the closets upstairs. "That is all very proper and civil, I am sure," said Mrs. Bennet, "and I dare say that she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir?" The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence." "I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family?" "She has only one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and a very extensive property." "Ah!" cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head, "then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that in the point of true beauty, Miss de Boaux is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of a distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her from making that progress in many accomplishments, which she could not otherwise have failed of, as I am informed by the lady, who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies." "Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court." "Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her from being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, has deprived the British court of its highest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased with the idea, and you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. I have more than once observed Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed to be born a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of grieving her conscience, would be adorned by her. These are the kinds of little things which please her ladyship, and it is the sort of attention which I conceive myself particularly bound to pay." "You judge very properly," said Mr. Bennet, "and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether those pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or the result of previous study?" "They arrive chiefly from what is passing at the time, although I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such elegant little compliments as may be adapted to ordinary circumstances. I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible." Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except in an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. By tea-time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and the book was produced, but on beholding it, for everyone announced that it should be from a circulating library, he started back, and, begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gasped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with a very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, "Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard, and if he does, Colonel Foster will hire him? My aunt told me herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more of it, and ask whether Mr. Denny comes back forth from town." Lydia was bid by her 2 eldest sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin." And then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as an antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he had acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruptions, and promised that it should not occur again. Oh, and promised that if it should occur... No, I did read that correctly. That is an interesting phrasing. And promised that it should not occur again if he would resume his book. But Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behavior as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet, and prepared for backgammon. Chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society. Whoa, that is brutal. The greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father, and though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms, without forming at it any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally a great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head living in retirement, and the consequential feelings of an early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bow, where the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect for which he held her high rank, and his veneration for her as his patroness, mingling with a very good opinion of himself, on his authority as a clergyman, and his rights as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance, and humility. That is a fascinating blend of personality traits. Having now a good house and very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbird family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters. This is so very odd to me, the whole marrying cousins thing. It's like, oh, it's a little close genetically, folks. Maybe we don't do that? But, ladies and gentlemen, the past. And in some parts of the world, the present. Having now a good house and very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by the common report. This was his plan of amends, of atonement for inheriting their father's estate, and though he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous and disinterested on his own part. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, and established all the strictest notions of what was due to seniority, and for the first evening she was a settled choice. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mr. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his patronage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes, the mistress, for it might be found at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane that he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take up any to say. She could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must mention, she felt it incumbent to hint, was very likely to soon be engaged. Mr. Collins had to only change from Jane to Elizabeth, and soon it was done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, and trusted that she soon might have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them, at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him and to have his liberty to himself. For thither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaged with one of the largest folios in the collection, but readily talking to Mr. Bennet, with little cessation, of his house and the garden at Hunsford. Such doings discomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library he had always been sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he had told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room of the house, he was used to be free from it there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters on their walk. And Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely well pleased to close his large book and go. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assets on that of his cousins, their time passed until they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or really a new muslin in a shop window, could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man, whom they had never seen before, of a most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with an officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air, all wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined if possible to find out, led the way across the street under the pretence of wanting something new in the opposite shop. Fortunately, he had gained the pavement when the 2 gentlemen turned back and had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly, and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham. Ah, yes, Wickham. I remember Wickham, who had returned with him the day before town, and he was happy to say that he had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favor. He had all the best of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party were still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingham were seen riding up the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the 2 gentlemen came directly towards them, and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, as Bingley always is, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger. And Elizabeth happened to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, with all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed color. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine, but it was impossible to not long know. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what had passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they would come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlor window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the 2 eldest from their recent absence were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she would have known nothing about, if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop-boy in the street, who had told her that they were to not send any draughts to Netherfield because the Bennets were on their way, when her civility was claimed towards Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with the very best politeness, which he returned with as much and more, apologizing for his intrusion without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself over might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to their notice. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by the excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by the exclamations and inquiries of the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and we're talking about Wickham, had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the shire. She was watching him at the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, And had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Liddy would have certainly continued the occupation. But unluckily, no one passed the windows except for a few of the officers, who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses at the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham, and to give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets, and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and was assured with unwavering civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either or both, had they appeared to be wrong, she could no more explain such behavior than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but had even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before. Something he supposed might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. And with that, we will end it for the evening. Have a lovely night. Sleep well. And remember, if you want to help me continue to expand and grow, please subscribe to the channel, and we will see you all next time. Never give up, never surrender, sleep well.